the medical community and the scientific community have found associations between mitochondrial dysfunction, which is kind of broadly, it means a lot of things, but mitochondria don't functioning well. And if we know mitochondria make energy, but they also move and they also produce other things. And so dysfunction can happen at multiple different levels, the same way that human dysfunction, we can be sick in different ways, right? So the mitochondria can be dysfunctional or sick also in different ways. But the medical and the scientific community has linked mitochondrial dysfunction to every disease that I know of. So if you go on PubMed or you Google whatever disease you want and mitochondrial dysfunction, there is most likely an article that documents some evidence of mitochondrial dysfunction in that disease.
Hello and welcome back to the Energy Blueprint podcast. I'm your host, Ari Witten, and I am incredibly excited about today's guest, who is an expert in my personal favorite topic, which is mitochondria. So his name is Dr. Martin Picard. He's an assistant professor of behavioral medicine in psychiatry and neurology at Columbia University. He obtained his PhD in mitochondrial biology of aging in 2012. He then moved to the University of Pennsylvania for a postdoctoral fellowship in the Center for Mitochondrial and Epigenomic Medicine with the famed mitochondrial researcher, Doug Wallace. For over a decade, Martin has been studying mitochondria and has worked closely with leading experts in the field of mitochondrial research. In 2015, he joined the faculty at Columbia University, where he established the Mitochondrial Signaling Laboratory. He's currently investigating mechanisms of mind-body interactions, specifically regarding novel principles that underlie mitochondrial responses to stressors, the maintenance of human health, and the influence of mitochondrial health on complex cellular and physiological processes, including aging and resistance to disease and stress, resilience, and many, many other aspects of health, including, of course, energy levels. So I am incredibly excited to introduce you all to Dr. Martin Picard, and I think you are going to absolutely love this episode. So what you do, Dr. Picard, is you work in a field called mitochondrial psychobiology. So can you tell everyone exactly what that means?
Yes, that's a good question. It's basically the intersection of mitochondria and the biological processes, the things that happens there in the cell inside the organelle, and then what happens in the mind, right? So if we simplify this, it's basically mind mitochondria science, kind of like mind body. But here we dive a little deeper than just the body generally, and we specifically focus on mitochondria. In part because mitochondria are the source of energy, right? That's where the reason we breathe, the reason we eat is to fuel the mitochondria, right? The ultimate purpose of breathing, and maybe why the breath is so common across all ancient traditions and religions. The breath is connected to bringing oxygen into the body, and then where does oxygen go in the body? It goes in the mitochondria. So we study, because mitochondria are so essential to energy, we study how the mind and the mitochondria interact, and hopefully is going to help us understand better how we humans experience the world and manage to stay healthy most of the time, and then why we get sick once in a while.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to back up just a minute. I want to get back to mitochondrial psychobiology in just a minute, but let's back up and just talk about what mitochondria are and kind of and you can do that very quickly. I know that, that topic in and of itself could be 3 hours long, but just a brief description of what mitochondria are and their vision or their role in human health has for a long time been conceptualized as, sort of just these mindless energy generators in our cells that just pump out energy. They take in glucose and fat and they pump out ATP. And that's kind of what mitochondria are good for. And in the last 10 or so years, there's been a really a reimagining within the scientific community of the role of mitochondria in human health. So kind of talk to me about your perception of how the scientific community's perception of mitochondria has changed over the last couple decades.
Mm-hmm. That's a really good, I think an important transition that is currently happening. And, a long time ago, about 1.5 billion years ago, something happened that the only thing that existed on the planet were unicellular organisms, right? They were bacteria. There were different kinds of bacteria, little cells that didn't talk to each other very much, probably. Some could use oxygen to make energy, and some others could not use oxygen, and they were fermenting type bacteria like yeast. And then at some point, a bigger kind of cell, bacterium, engulfed a smaller oxygen-consuming bacterium. And then that smaller oxygen-consuming bacterium, instead of being digested and used for food by the bigger one, actually managed to stick around. And that, theory goes, became the mitochondria. And so, and for some reason in evolutionary history, that event seemed to have been critical to the development of what's called multicellular life, right? Like animals, including from as small as little worms, flies, mice, dogs, and then humans, thinking, feeling, conscious organisms, evolved from this. It's called endosymbiosis, and the symbiosis of things living together, and then endo because it's inside of. So the endosymbiotic origin of mitochondria apparently was a key evolutionary piece in making complex life possible, and then the complex animals that we are. And so from their bacterial ancestry and origin, mitochondria were discovered about in the late 1800s, early 1900s, first observed under the microscope, and people saw that they could move and they could do things, and they were named after their actual morphology. They change. Sometimes they can look like small little beans. That's mostly what you see in the textbook, and if you Google mitochondria images, that's what you see, a bunch of beans or peanut shaped things, and then they have like an outer membrane and inner membrane, and inside of that is the mitochondrial DNA, which is actually circular, like the bacterial DNA. So those are the kind of things that let us know that they used to be bacteria. And then in the 40s, 50s, 60s, people started to focus heavily on the energy production capacity or function of mitochondria. And Peter Mitchell won a Nobel Prize for understanding how mitochondria could store energy and actually transform energy from food and oxygen into membrane potential. How mitochondria become charged like little batteries. And then he figured out that this energy potential, and once a mitochondria charged, that energy can be used to make ATP. And I think most people on your podcast will know about ATP, adenosine triphosphate, as the energy currency of the cell and of most living organisms. And then that was the pervading view of mitochondria, their energy powerhouse. And I think most people know about the powerhouse of the cell analogy. We actually think it's a bad analogy because it's very mechanistic. It's very mechanical, I should say. Mm. And mitochondria are so much more than powerhouses, and that's, I think, in line with the new transition away from this powerhouse analogy, which portray mitochondria as little machines, right? A powerhouse, it takes an input, transforms it into an output, and then that's power generation or transformation. Mitochondria actually have this beautiful complex life where they interact with each other. They can fuse. So two smaller mitochondria can come together, fuse, become a longer one. So they change shape via their interactions with each other. Then they can undergo the opposite process of fission. So a longer tubular, imagine like a long spaghetti, can become fragmented into little beans. So that's called fission, mitochondrial fission. And the fused mitochondria, or the fragmented or fizzed mitochondria, also have different functions. So their shape is linked to their function, which is what we see a lot in biology. And now our view is transitioning from this dynamic view of mitochondria, which you can observe through movies and videos, some of which are on our website, and you can find some of those on the internet now. And then people are starting to realize, actually, mitochondria, great, they move, they make energy, but they actually produce signals. They're sensitive to stuff, and they generate stuff. So what we're finding is that mitochondria can respond to different hormones or to different metabolic signals, and that's fairly well documented. And then mitochondria release other kind of biochemical signals, and maybe other kinds of, vibrational signals, or, electromagnetic or something else that can be transmitted between mitochondria and other parts of the cell, including the nucleus, where the nuclear genome kind of rests and waits for signals and information to know which gene to turn on, which genes to turn off through epigenetics, and maybe we'll talk about that. And then ultimately to the rest of the cell, the rest of the body. So mitochondria can send signals, including their own genome. They can release their DNA into the cell cytoplasm, the internal part of the cell, or even into the bloodstream. And then those mitochondria-derived signals can go everywhere in the body. So now the view that we're starting to develop is one of a kind of a communicating collective of mitochondria distributed across different organs, different cells that talk to each other.
Yes, and I want to get into that. I want to get into this kind of mitochondrial DNA leaking into the bloodstream, and several of the other things you talked about, how mitochondria sense things that are going on in the environment and modulate gene expression. First, I want to ask you to kind of briefly summarize what we now know about the role of mitochondria in human health, very broadly, and just very quick summary. But again, we used to think of mitochondria, as you said, as these just powerhouses of the cell, just kind of taking orders from the DNA, which was the big boss of the cell, and their job is just to burn off carbs and fats and produce energy. And we now know there's so much more than that. But what is the role of these mitochondria? Why are mitochondria so important? And what do we now know in the science as far as the links with different diseases and aging and so on?
Yes. So the medical community and the scientific community have found associations between mitochondrial dysfunction, which is kind of broadly, it means a lot of things, but mitochondria don't functioning well. And if we know mitochondria make energy, but they also move and they also produce other things. And so dysfunction can happen at multiple different levels, the same way that human dysfunction, we can be sick in different ways, right? So the mitochondria can be dysfunctional or sick also in different ways. But the medical and the scientific community has linked mitochondrial dysfunction to every disease that I know of. So if you go on PubMed or, you Google whatever disease you want and mitochondrial dysfunction, there is most likely an article that documents some evidence of mitochondrial dysfunction in that disease. So what we don't know there.
And even the aging process itself, more broadly.
Yes. Aging, there's a very large body of scientific evidence linking aging process and mitochondria. And I think quite convincingly showing that mitochondria and dysfunctional mitochondria actually can precipitate or accelerate the aging process. Mm-hmm. And one question, you look at the scientific literature and you Google, whatever disease you're interested in, like Alzheimer's or cardiovascular cancer and mitochondrial dysfunction, then you find all these papers. You never know if it's the disease that happened through some process that we don't understand that caused mitochondrial defects or dysfunction, or if it's a mitochondrial dysfunction that is a primary cause or driver of the disease, right? Most studies don't allow us to understand this. So the state of the field is there's a lot of evidence showing mitochondria are not happy. Mitochondria don't work normally in disease. Now, are they the cause of disease or are they the result of disease? And that's where, there's a smaller body of research that addresses this directionality. And a big piece in that effort came in the 1980s, actually, where Doug Wallace and Ian Holt in England, they almost simultaneously discovered that there were defects in the mitochondrial DNA, so mutations or deletions in the mitochondrial genome that were the cause of human disease. So that was the first time that it was demonstrated that when the mitochondria don't work properly, this can actually cause disease.
Yeah.
And since then, there's been hundreds of studies that document these kind of connections. And, every week here in the clinic, we see patients who walk in with defects in their mitochondria, and then you see the consequences. You see the consequences on their ability to exercise, to move, their ability to digest food, their ability to, move about, and their ability to think and to process things, with cognitive function. So it's very clear now that when the mitochondria don't work properly, they can cause disease and they can precipitate a lot of age-related disorders.
Right. And one of the other lines of evidence from lots of studies is, interventions that target mitochondrial health, whether it could be something natural like, let's say polyphenols or EGCG from green tea or something like that, that acts to bolster mitochondrial health in some way. Or various other types of hormesis, exercise, or many other types of hormesis that we know have effects on mitochondria, we know also confer various protective effects against various kinds of diseases and have the potential to increase lifespan, or at the very least health span.
Yeah, for sure. And like you mentioned, exercise. I think exercise is probably the best health promoting intervention. If it was a drug, it'd be amazing. People would take it all the time.
Yeah.
There's so many good side effects, and we don't actually know why exercise is good for you. There's no mechanistic understanding of why exercise is so good for health span, and it's not quite sure it makes it extends longevity. People who exercise a lot don't tend to live 200 years old, and there's a lot of people who never formally exercise, and they don't do marathon running and all of this, and they end up living healthy and living very long. But physical activity, being active, we don't know why that's good. And one theory that we tend to favor is that exercise and physical activity is good for you because it stimulates your mitochondria.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
that's hard to prove empirically.
So this is a nice segue. So we know that exercise, physical exercise and movement is very important for mitochondrial health. What are some of the other factors that you think are really important in mitochondrial health? And then I want to transition into what your area of focus is, which is the mind and the mitochondria link.
Mm-hmm.
So are there any other factors before we get to the mind mitochondria? Are there any other factors worth mentioning here that are key players in mitochondrial health?
Something that's been studied a lot, exercise is, we've known for a long time, exercise increases the number of mitochondria in your body. So if you go from being a completely not physically active individual, like, couch potato scenario chronically, and then you go and you say, I'm going to run a marathon, and then you start working out a lot, you can double the amount of mitochondria in your body, right? So per amount of muscle, per gram of muscle, you can double the number of mitochondria in your muscle just by stimulating the body. And we think that this probably happens also in the brain. The brain makes more mitochondria, and the muscles make more mitochondria if you're more active. So that we've known for a long time. Exercise improves the number of mitochondria, also changes how they function. Another thing that's been studied quite a bit is the health benefits of not eating too much. So some people have called this calorie restriction, because that's how it was done in animals originally. You would restrict the number of food pellets that you gave animals, and then kind of magically animals started to live longer and be healthier. There's some issues with these studies because the control group, the control animals that eat as much as they want, they're housed always in little cages, right? It's very unnatural to live for a rat or a mouse or any animal that were used in these studies to live in such a small shoe-sized box. And that's how laboratory animals are kept. Shoe-sized box, no ability to exercise. Most studies don't have a running wheel or anything else. And then there's an abundance of food, as much as you want. So in evolutionary history, these little animals, us included, we always had to do some movement or some hunting or, something else to get calories. And there, all of a sudden, in evolutionary history, that's a very kind of abrupt change where you have zero need to do physical activity, and then there's as much food as you want. So you could argue in all the calorie restriction studies, the control group is actually an overfed, sedentary couch potato situation. And then it's not surprising that if you just bring down the number of calories, you actually maybe normalize things a bit more.
Right. It's interesting. I never thought about it that way, but it's absolutely true. Especially, I assume there were running wheels in the cages.
They were not.
That's not good. Yeah.
So from those studies, they were called calorie restriction. And then now there've been a lot of human interest in calorie restriction. And there's some studies that are underway, where people try not to eat too much, and then they're perpetually hungry for life. Apparently, I've never done a study on this, but I know some people who have worked with these people, and apparently these people are not very nice to work with because they're a little grumpy, and feeling hungry is chronically, is not a super pleasant thing to do, and that's why a lot of people cannot stick with this for very long.
Yeah.
There's more recent interest in intermittent fasting, and maybe you and your audience is familiar with this, where you eat normally, but then you don't eat for a half day or for a full day or for 2 days. There are different models of this, but I think the idea here is once in a while feeling hungry is a good thing. Mm-hmm. And what we know from the animal studies and some human literature is feeling hungry actually recruits and stimulates in the organism a lot of very good adaptive processes. So the same way that when you exercise, you stress the body and then you stress a muscle, then the muscle responds to this, becomes bigger and becomes stronger. For the next time it's recruited or it's used, and it's stronger and it's adapted. So the same kind of thing happens. If you feel a little hungry, the body feels like, ooh, like now there's no sugar around. I need to start using my mitochondria to use the fats and to use the proteins, and then the mitochondria needed for this are not needed necessarily to burn up sugar. Mm-hmm. So if you feel hungry, typically, there's the blood and the tissue sugars are a little low, and then that forces different tissues to adapt by using the mitochondria. So it seems like feeling hungry a little bit, not overeating and not perpetually overloading your system with too much of anything, sugar or fat or proteins, is a good thing. And for some reason that stimulates good quality control in the cells, like autophagy, mitophagy. So the bad stuff gets removed and digested away, and then new mitochondria that are good, well functioning or synthesized. So exercise, not eating too much, these are two things that we know tend to be good for health, and probably at least part of the mechanism or part of the action is through promoting mitochondrial health.
Yeah. So we know one of the third factors now, that thanks to your research and the work of some of your colleagues, we know that the mind and a person's psychology can have a profound influence on our mitochondrial health as well. And you've done quite a bit of work. You've published some really amazing research papers that I recommend people read. One's called An Energetic View of Stress, Focused on Mitochondria. Another one's called Psychological Stress in Mitochondria, A Conceptual Framework. And these are really well worth digging into for anybody listening who's a health professional or just a science geek who's really interested in this topic. So as you mentioned, mitochondrial psychobiology, this mind-mitochondria link. And this kind of gets at the whole, Descartes mind-body dualism, and the fact that, we now know, it's pretty widely accepted, of course, that it's very widely accepted that we know that the mind has a profound influence on the body. There's lots of lines of evidence that we can speak to about how psychological factors influence biological health more broadly and various kinds of diseases. And we know, for example, childhood trauma can greatly increase risk of diseases later on in life, and many, many other aspects of this. So we know there's a link there. And yet, despite that, there is this kind of blurriness of what exactly is that communication. How does our mind communicate with our body? What are these channels of communication? And I think your work has uncovered a really important aspect of that. So can you speak to that? So what is this mind mitochondria link all about?
So that's probably my favorite topic. So so I appreciate talking with you about this. I would say exactly, the mind-body connection, and just dissociating these, as we know, is a little artificial, right? We, as humans, are really good to break things down into pieces, and that's the whole point of analysis, right? To break down into pieces, and all of our research methods are ways to break things down into into little digestible pieces that we can understand and, test mechanisms and all of that. But really, the whole system is an integrated system. And uh, as you say, there's well documented effects, for example, of psychological stress on the immune system. And there were seminal studies done, by the Kegel classers who showed medical students during exam periods, like at the end of the semester, who were super stressed out because they think their life is going to be done if they don't pass this exam, then they're more susceptible to infections. So they actually, if you expose them to some stressors, Sheldon Cohen did studies like this where they would sequester people, stress them or not stress them, and then expose them to like a flu virus in the nose, and then showed that, and when people are stressed, their immune system is down and they're more vulnerable to getting the cold and to infections. And then the Kegel cluster showed that wound healing, something as fundamental as if there's a wound on your skin or on your gum, how quickly that wound heals, which is also an integrated process. You need cells to kick in in their proliferation. You need the immune system to come in, produce some cytokines, and the blood flow needs to change, and it's a whole organized process. And they showed people, when you're stressed, and if you experimentally stress someone, that slows down the wound healing, and it makes the person more vulnerable to infections. The immune system is modulated. So these are some of the old seminal work that's I'm not sure if it's taught so much in medical school, but it's not part of kind of the framework, the general biomedical framework. And what we think one of the reasons is because we don't have a really good understanding of the basic molecular or biological mechanisms by which this happens, right? So there's the mind here, you experience something, there's a subjective experience, which is very real, right? Whatever is in your head, whatever we experience subjectively, it's very real to the person who's experiencing it. And then there's these biological changes that happen in the immune system, in the wound, right? Or in the brain. These are very real biological changes. What's connecting these things, right? How do subjective experience get translated in a language that the biology actually follows and then responds to? And our guiding hypothesis is that mitochondria and the flow of energy is that connection or that interface.
Now, a quick question here. There's a lot of people out there who have conceptualized stress, psychological stress, and how it affects the body through different conceptual models. So, for example, one of the most basic ones that's been around in the natural medicine community has been the adrenal fatigue model. And it's like stress is bad for you because it taxes the adrenals, which produce this stress hormone called cortisol. And if you do that too much, then it wears the adrenals out, then you get low cortisol, and that's what mediates all these negative effects. Okay, then it was, as people realized that model was really way overly simplistic, a lot of people moved towards this HPA axis dysfunction model, which started to realize, hey, there's a couple players upstream of the adrenals, the hypothalamus and the pituitary, and those are really the key players. And so those are the most upstream things as far as what's sensing stress and mediating different effects in their body. Mm-hmm. And there's other people out there, like there's a guy out there who specializes in chronic fatigue syndrome, who I've interviewed on this podcast, named Ashok Gupta, who really says, no, the hypothalamus and pituitary are not the most upstream thing. It's actually the limbic system and the amygdala that are the most upstream thing. And then we have, for example, there was an article, I believe it was in the Scientific American, about some of your research with Douglas Wallace, where you guys, and I want to talk about some of the details of this study, but you basically subjected people to stress, and then you measured mitochondrial DNA in their blood. And I believe Douglas Wallace, I'm not going to get the quote exactly right, but he said something to the effect of mitochondria are probably the most sensitive thing in the body. And so you could maybe make the case in this model that it's actually the mitochondria that are the most upstream thing before any, sort of processing takes place in some of these brain centers. So what's your thoughts on how that should be conceptualized as far as what's the most upstream, most sensitive thing that is detecting the first immediate signals of what's going on in the environment.
The work that you referred to was a work that was done in collaboration with Anna Marsland and Brett Kaufman in Pittsburgh, which shows that psychological stress, if you expose someone to a psychological stress, you ask them to do, to speak in front of a camera, and then they feel stress and they feel a bit angry and uncomfortable. We found that 30 minutes later, if you take blood and then you look in serum, there's more mitochondrial DNA that's released. And so that demonstrates mitochondria somehow respond to that subjective experience and then respond by releasing the mitochondrial genome. And, Doug is fantastic, and he commented on this study. And that's his view, right? That the mitochondria are the most sensitive thing in the body. I tend to agree. And I imagine that it's because, everything in the organism, from just being alive requires the flow of energy. And anything that is stressful, and by definition, something that's stressful is something that perturbs us, right? Something that is not stressful then doesn't elicit anything in the organism, and it's very hard to not be stressed or influenced by anything. I think if you're dead, if there's no flow of energy in the body, and the body is not animated by energy anymore, then the body cannot respond to to a stressor. But we respond to just a little word. Someone says one word, and that can trigger a whole kind of cascade. The heart starts to beat faster, hormones are released, blood pressure increases. We get warmer. The body actually gets warmer when we're stressed. So there are all of these changes. Every little bit of the stress response, from increasing heart rate or blood pressure to producing a new hormone or releasing a hormone, every little bit requires energy. So there's nothing in the body that moves or that changes that doesn't require energy. So because energy is so central to every little part of the stress response, from the single gene to the whole person, we think energy is, most likely one of the first things to change when there's stress. And then because energy flows mainly in the mitochondria in human beings and in, complex animals, then mitochondria must be one of the first places to actually perceive, to have the ability to perceive that change in energy flux, and then respond to that. So, and there's mitochondria everywhere. The three models that you mentioned, the adrenal fatigue, the HPA axis, and the limbic amygdala, models, I think these overlap in different ways. And, there's mitochondria everywhere in the amygdala, in the hypothalamus and thalamus and the pituitary gland, and in the adrenal glands. And what's remarkable is that, the stress hormones, most people will know about cortisol, which is made in the adrenal glands. Well, where in the adrenal glands is cortisol being made, right? It's actually in the mitochondria.
Yep.
So every stress hormone and every also sex hormones, all of these hormones that are derived from cholesterol, they're called steroid hormones. They're all made in the mitochondria. So for some evolutionary reason, the body thought it was a good idea to, put the synthesis of one of the most important family of hormones, the sex hormones that define, female from male, and the stress hormones that allow us to survive different events, throughout life. Those are actually synthesized in the organelle that sustains energy. So there's not really a good, we can speculate as to why that is, but from our view, I think it's a good illustration of how tightly knit those things are: the stress response and the energetic capacity of the organism.
Yeah. I'm curious, are you familiar with Dr. Robert Naviaux's work on the cell danger response?
Yes.
I feel like this ties in to your model perfectly. I think you're doing these two lines of research that you guys have been doing completely separately, and yet you're basically arriving to a large extent at the same conclusion, which is mitochondria are essentially the most sensitive thing in the body as far as detecting environmental signals, and then they are determining, from the model of Dr. Robert Naviaux, they're determining whether they're going to stay in peacetime metabolism, as he calls it, which is energy mode, where they're actively taking in fuel and producing ATP and powering the organism, or if they're detecting threats, whether they be pathogens, infections, or, chemical exposures, or sleep deprivation, or psychological stress, or physical stress and overexercise, or any other number of stressors. And then if they're detecting lots of that input, then they switch out of peacetime metabolism, out of producing energy, towards defense mode or cell danger mode, which directs energy and resources of the organism towards defending the organism against the threat. Mm-hmm. And obviously, the work that I do with people with fatigue and increasing their energy, from this model, the most basic way we define fatigue is from the mitochondrial perspective. Too much of your mitochondria have been shifted out of energy mode into cell danger mode. Now, he talks about purines, purinergic signaling, and the leakage of like ATP and ADP outside of the cell, and this being a critical signaling molecule that signals other cells in the system about the threat present. Mm-hmm. Now, in some of your research, you guys have found that mitochondrial DNA actually gets leaked into the bloodstream. And that this, in your words, this is a quote from you and commenting on some of this research, you said this circulating mitochondrial DNA acts like a hormone. And so it's somewhat mimicking the adrenal gland's response to cortisol, and it's having all these effects on the rest of the cells where it's communicating, hey, there's a threat present, there's danger, we're under stress, we need to shift more into defense mode. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of similarities, like I said, between your two lines of research, and yet you're to some extent talking about different molecules being the key signaling molecules. So can you kind of make sense of all that for me?
Yeah, I think both models converge, and I love Bob's. We actually met about a year ago at a conference, and it was fantastic to get to chat with him. So I think there's a lot of overlap, and I think we resonate on many different levels. I think the same way that if you think about mitochondria not again as a powerhouse, but as communicating organelles and organisms. Other kind of, living organisms that coexist in the same space, right? That share information, that actually communicate and physically interact, that, synchronize their function. These are all properties of mitochondria. They're also properties of every other social animals, social organisms. So we're starting to see mitochondria as social organisms, and organisms that communicate with each other don't communicate through only one mechanism, right? So there's not one type of thing that you do to talk to another person. There's, there are words. They're also nonverbal, right? We all know that whatever expression you have on your face, whatever you do with your hands, with your gestures, that can communicate a lot, right? And nowadays,
the classic wife statement, it's not what you said, it's how you said it. Melody, right?
The tone, yes, exactly. And nowadays we have like phones, right? And like emails, and you can text, and you can FaceTime, and you can do like all sorts of things. So we have multiple redundant modes of communication. And the same way, if you look at neurons in the brain, neurons talk to each other through a variety of mechanisms. Or electrical gap junction, related processes where electrical signals can communicate, can be transmitted, very quickly. And then there's chemical chemical signals, at the synapses, with serotonin and dopamine and some other things. So even, very specific biological systems have multiple redundant ways of communication. And if you take an analogy, the mitochondria trying to communicate states of threat or, states of well-being to the rest of the organism, if they only had one switch, it's either on or off, that might not work really well. It's like if we only had one word to talk to each other, either it's good or it's bad, right? That would not be great. We have a vocabulary with thousands of words that we can combine with, in different sequences and so on. And it's the same thing, for computers and, digital information. It's the flexibility you have when you have multiple signals that you can combine in different ways. The texture you can get out of this in an image and, a picture or in a biological system is remarkable. So the same way we take all sorts of words and can communicate some very sophisticated ideas, biological systems have also learned to do this. And that's why there's not only one neurotransmitter in the brain, there's several. And that's why there's, I think, multiple different kinds of communication molecules that come from mitochondria. And I think it's to communicate the complexity of what's happening at the subcellular level that needs to be communicated throughout the organism.
Yeah. Now, what sort of big picture, what is this signaling all about? So we know that psychological stress, what's going on in the mind, affects mitochondria, can cause mitochondrial dysfunction, can cause the contents of mitochondria, whether it's the DNA, whether it's purines like ATP and ADP, to leak out of the cell into the bloodstream where it's doing some sort of signaling. What is this all about? What is this signaling actually trying to accomplish? Like, from an evolutionary perspective, why are our bodies designed this way? What good is it actually doing?
One way to think about it is not as, a purely kind of dysfunctional system, like stress is bad, it causes these molecules and then that causes disease, but, not all stress causes disease, right? And, I think many people will relate to stress being actually a pretty stimulating thing, right? And if you have zero stress, some people need quite a bit of stress to actually get something done. And, with stress can come motivation and some other things. There's, Bruce McEwen likes to call it toxic stress when it's not good anymore. But, all of this stuff before toxic stress can actually stimulate, healing and stimulate adaptation and strength of different functions.
And actually bolster the organism's health and resistance.
Yes.
Longevity.
Yeah, and you mentioned hormesis earlier, right? That's that idea. There's little stressors will stimulate processes in the body that if that stress persists, that can become damaging. But if it's acute, like you go to the gym for an hour or, you walk up the stairs instead of taking the elevator, that will stimulate things in your legs and in your heart and in your brain. And then, your body will become a little stronger, as a result. So that's hormesis, that the body adapting to challenge or to stress and then becoming stronger as a result. So I think the different processes you were mentioning, we see as communication. Why? Why would mitochondria release all of these things? We think it's the same reason as, why do people talk to each other, right? Because that's how things need to work. Why do different organs in the body talk to each other? Why do the different organs are connected with a cardiovascular system through blood? Yeah? Information needs to be exchanged. I think it's a basic property of life. And that's how complex systems, function and operate. That's how living organisms fight entropy. To remain healthy is to go against the forces of physics. If we were subject to the forces of physics and we didn't have energy flow to resist that, then we would just decay, right? We managed to go against that and to go against just dissipation of matter for 80, 100 years because of the flow of energy and because there's communication. So it's a bit similar if we were to look at the brain from a primitive view, like I don't know how long ago, like a century ago, and we would say, when you stress the brain through the eye, so that would be like stimulating something from the eye of an animal, let's say, and then there's all of these chemicals being released in the back part of the brain, the occipital region, where the visual information is processed. And there's like GABA and serotonin and like dopamine and these things would be released. Then you would say, this must be dysfunctional. But then in hindsight, it's like, no, this is neurons need to talk to each other to make sense of the information that's coming in. And that stress, that perturbation that's coming in is actually meaningful information if you can decode it. So in order for the system to decode it, make sense of it, and then mount an intelligent response that will allow the organism and the system to remain alive and to remain healthy and to adapt to it, there needs to be communication, right? That's how complex networks and complex systems work and process information and adapt. So I think that's how we see those signals that mitochondria release. If you look at it simplistically, you say mitochondrial DNA release, bad, triggers inflammation, bad. You say mitochondria release these molecules, it has multiple effects. We've looked at one thing, inflammation. Yes, inflammation can be bad, but inflammation is also important for the adaptation of the adaptive processes and so on. So I think the overly simplistic explanation or interpretation comes from our lack of sufficient knowledge and maybe the simplicity of our minds.
Yeah, absolutely. So we know that there's this link between stress, the brain's perception of stress, or the mind's perception of stress, and causing these various potentially negative effects in mitochondria. And certainly if the stress is very chronic, almost certainly very negative effects on mitochondrial health. We also know that there is an emerging link through a number of studies with mitochondrial dysfunction and psychological factors like or brain-related conditions like depression and anxiety, and even neurodegenerative diseases going more into brain conditions. But we know that there's this link there. Do you think that this, kind of a simple model of this, and I'm sure that this is oversimplifying and leaving out of a lot of complexity, but do you think it's reasonable to say that stress on the system can cause mitochondrial dysfunction that can contribute very directly to things like anxiety and depression?
I think that's very likely. And at this point, we don't have all of the pieces of the puzzle to say for sure that this is how it happens. And that depression and anxiety and bipolar disorder and schizophrenia and so on, or mitochondrial disorders. We do see these psychiatric disorders more frequently in people who come in with a genetic defect in the mitochondria, like I mentioned earlier. So that's fairly strong evidence that if something is wrong with the mitochondria, this can cause defects of, perception of reality or, perception of the world and regulation of mood and affect and so on. So there's some evidence, but we don't know for sure that the stress causes psychopathology through the mitochondria. But I think it's likely. And something that we identified recently, we wanted to know, does how you feel influence your mitochondria? And how you feel, meaning both negative stuff like stress and sadness and depression, but also positive stuff like feeling inspired, feeling love, closeness, and trust, and feeling motivated and uplifted, and these kind of good things that we feel once in a while. So we wanted to know, are these things predictive of how well someone's mitochondria work, or is it that how the mitochondria work predict how you feel in the future? And we worked with Alyssa Epple in San Francisco, who had this beautiful study where they had women fill out questionnaires, diary. So in the morning, it takes about 10 minutes, and you say how much stress you feel right now, how stressful do you think the day is going to be, and then how much love, closeness, and trust you experience, and then how much sadness and rejection and anger do you feel. And then they would do this also in the evening. So then for a whole week, people did this at home. It was like a little take-home homework. And then so we had measures of how positive and also how negative people felt in the morning, in the evening, for 7 days in a row. And then the beautiful thing that Alyssa did is that she had people come in on the 4th day. They came into the research lab, and then they gave blood. And from the blood, we isolated white blood cells, which are cells of the immune system that have mitochondria. Then we measured the mitochondrial health. So we developed a little method to get at how much energy the mitochondria can generate for the white blood cells. And then we looked at how people felt on the first day, day 1, day 2, day 3. Does that predict how well the mitochondria work on day 4? So is it the mood that's influencing the mitochondria, or the mind and the mitochondria, or is it the mitochondria that's influencing how the mind factors or the mood on days 5, 6, and 7, right? And what we found was that it was particularly how positive people felt on the day just before the blood draw, where the association was the strongest. So how people felt the day before they came, how positive, especially in the evening, was associated with how much energy the mitochondria could generate the next morning. And to us, that was, mind-blowing. The effects were pretty strong. And so what that suggests, that the data from that study, and now we need to do more studies and replicate this and look at this and, more people than in men and women, is that 10 to 15% of mitochondrial energy production capacity in the immune system is explained by how you feel the night before.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
That's a lot.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, in the other direction, was there a correlation at all as far as the health of mitochondria predicting how a person felt?
There was zero association for the things that we looked at.
Oh, wow. That's interesting.
Yeah. So I was a bit surprised by that. And so the strength of the association is definitely stronger. The mitochondria don't predict how people feel as much as how they feel predict, how the mitochondria work. But again, this is one study in 91 women, and there's definitely a lot more work to be done. And I think there's nothing in biology that's linear, and it's very unlikely that it's a purely unidirectional process.
Now, speaking to that other direction, do you think it's reasonable to think that there is a relationship between mitochondrial health and specifically the person's perception of stress or a person's resilience to stress? So, for example, I've taken from some research, and it's funny, I have an image that I've used and modified that I took from this random animal study. I'm actually wondering if this is one of your studies. I found this study years ago, and I kind of repurposed this image from this study and modified in a bunch of ways. And I literally, right before this interview, found this exact image. I mean, the original one that I took on your website for your lab. And it's a concept that I've termed the resilience threshold. And it's basically talking about how, to the degree that we have bigger, stronger, healthier mitochondria, more of them, our cells, literally at the cellular level, we know, at least at that level, whether this correlates with the mind's perception of stress is another thing, but at least on the cellular level, we know that bigger, stronger, healthier mitochondria and more of them means a much bigger capacity to tolerate the stressors of the modern world and to not experience what's called allostatic overload, and where you get symptoms and pathology and disease, where the mitochondria are overwhelmed by the stress, start shutting down energy production, shifting out of that peacetime metabolism into defense mode, throwing off purines, throwing off mitochondrial DNA, causing oxidative stress and oxidative damage, and symptoms like fatigue. So the more that mitochondria you have, the higher your resilience threshold, and the less likely you are to experience that issue, at least on the cellular level. Now, first of all, so two questions. One, would you agree with the way I explained that? And then two, do you think that this could also potentially translate into the mind's perception of stress and how resilient a person is?
So yes, I think you portrayed the situation very clearly and very well. I definitely agree with that. And yes, we're testing that idea at the moment. So what we found a few years ago was that in mice, if you perturb the mitochondria, so you decrease the ability of mitochondria to make energy, or you cause mitochondrial dysfunction, when you expose a mouse with abnormal mitochondria compared to a genetically identical mouse with normal mitochondria, the mouse with the abnormal mitochondria will perceive the same psychological stressor very differently.
Mm.
And the biological response in the body of the mouse in response to that psychological stressor is very different. And even though, under normal conditions, you look at these mice, you can't tell them apart, right? One of them has a mitochondrial dysfunction, the other doesn't. But when you stress them, you see all of these, beautiful multi-systemic, response signatures that emerges, and that's regulated by the mitochondria. So in animals, and there's a lot of research that, starts this way, right? As a proof of concept. You perturb the mitochondria, you can do this mechanistically, and then you can show if I change one thing in the mitochondria, I change stress perception. So now we've moved away from the animal work, and now we're testing this in humans. So we have people come into the lab, and then we profile their mitochondria. So we measure their mitochondrial phenotypes, or we call them the mitotypes. And then we quantify each person's mitotypes. Each person's mitochondria are pretty different. And there's a big spectrum of how much energy a person's mitochondria can generate, and then what kind of what style of mitochondria they have, right? The same way that for personality, there's not like a higher or lower personality. There's different types or qualities of personalities, right? The big five personality characteristics or things like that. So we're trying to develop at the moment tools to do this same kind of things, personality profiling with mitochondria.
I want to tie a few things into this. You said something at the beginning of this podcast talking about exercise, that we know that exercise can basically double the amount of mitochondria in a person's muscle tissues, and probably other tissues in the body as well. I'll speak to that from a different angle. There's a number of studies that have looked at mitochondrial capacity over the course of people's lifespan. And you're probably familiar with some or all of this research, where they basically take muscle biopsies. They look at the amount of mitochondria in the cells, and they measure mitochondrial capacity in various ways. And they've shown in most of these studies, the results are very consistent, that between the ages of about 40 to 70, most people lose about half of their mitochondrial capacity. And there's evidence suggesting that probably from 20 to 40, people lose about half of their mitochondrial capacity. So over the course of 20 to 70, most likely they're losing something like 75% of their mitochondrial capacity in most people. So, and I will also say that there's evidence looking at specifically people who are highly active, like people who are athletes, but who are 70. And they've shown that those people don't lose half their mitochondrial capacity.
Exactly.
So that hormesis, the presence of hormesis, seems to be the defining factor. Not aging, but the degree of hormesis seems to be the defining factor in how much mitochondrial capacity a person loses. But we know also that circadian rhythm disruption and sleep deprivation can damage mitochondria in various ways. Melatonin plays a critical role in mitochondrial health. Man-made toxins play a critical role. We know there's a gut mitochondria link. We know nutrition plays a big role. Psychological stress plays a big role. So we know all of these different factors tie into this. So the way I would conceptualize this is, over the course of a person's lifespan, to the degree that they're lacking hormesis, not eating a good diet, not minding their circadian rhythm and sleep habits, not exercising, have psychological stress, have exposure to lots of toxins, they are basically, it's a perfect storm of factors that they're losing mitochondria rapidly, and the mitochondria they do have are becoming more and more damaged and dysfunctional, ultimately leading to a progressive lowering of a person's resilience threshold and capacity to adapt to stressors, where they're much more likely to be overwhelmed by stress, have a very low threshold for tolerating stress, and so on, and much more likely to have those mitochondria actually be overwhelmed such that they get pathology and disease. Mm-hmm. That's my 2-minute overarching model of human health. I'm just curious if you would agree with my general framework there.
Yeah. Isn't it amazing? Within the context of everything you mentioned, most people remain healthy for most of their life.
It's so funny. I was just saying that to my wife the other day. I was like, it's amazing to me, given how many things we're doing wrong, most people are doing wrong. It's amazing that we make it past 40.
Yeah, there's, it's a superb resilience and, ability to adapt. You find people who go through the harshest and, most horrible things, and they adapt to this and actually, experience growth in some cases. And the organism is just such a masterpiece of adaptation. We have the ability, physically, physiologically, but also psychologically and mentally, people adapt to amazing things. Again, adaptation requires energy. And, to some extent, that's one way when, you see people in a clinic who are very sick, or people who, end up, with disability that, last a long time, that's failure to adapt, right? So we can see disease not necessarily as kind of an anomaly that, arises spontaneously, but as a chronic failure to adapt. And people who have defective mitochondria seem to show that, and they're unable to bounce back from little things that other people would, including circadian rhythms and including maybe, normal daily stressors and other things. So yeah, I think it's phenomenal to see how resilient and how, well the organism can adapt to things. And ultimately I hope that our research is going to help to build a bioenergetic view of health. And we know so little about health. We know a lot about disease. We don't know very much about what keeps us healthy and what's the
and
what are the things.
That's such a good way of phrasing it. I would agree. We need to be spending, I would say, probably directing like 60 or 70% of funds towards studying health rather than studying how to fix disease. I think we'd get a lot further in fixing the healthcare model and actually helping people be healthy if we did.
Yeah, it's kind of we study disease, and then that leads to wanting to fix disease, and then that leads to developing, very targeted, specialized molecules, drugs, and then that leads to, the way that we practice medicine, which is palliative. And once disease is there, because we don't know what to do when there's no disease, so we need to wait for disease to happen, and then we come up with chemicals that, suppress some of these symptoms, and it's never addressing, it's never helping people to be healthy. It's remarkable.
And to your point, some of the key overarching themes that you've been talking about as far as your work, all of these different systems of the body are intertwined. So to a large extent, I would argue that the whole fundamental paradigm of seeking out some specific, molecule that's or biochemical process that's gone awry, and then developing a drug intervention to target this specific biochemical process and correct it is just myopic and so reductionistic and missing the big picture of how all these systems are intertwined.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The thing is, we don't know, we don't see the bigger picture yet. And if we did, I think we could probably, and if we had a less kind of mechanical view of how the system works, then we might be able to come up with a lot more, intelligent or holistic or personalized ways to help people, develop and harness their own resilience and ability to heal and recover.
Yeah.
And then I think that's the real way forward for healthcare.
Yeah, right on. I agree with you. I know you have to run, so I have one final question to you, which is, given everything you know about mitochondria, given everything you know about mitochondrial psychobiology and the research that you've done, what is one thing, one tip from the research, that you've done on a practical level, the one thing that you want to leave people with as something they can take from this field of mitochondrial psychobiology to apply in their lives to improve their health, improve their energy levels, improve their mitochondrial health?
That is a deep question. What I tend to think, and I think there's still more work to be done to be sure that's the case, but the things that you feel that make you, the things that you do that make you feel energetic, the people that you hang out with that make you feel uplifted and inspired, and so that subjective feeling of being energetic is probably so not so divorced from actually the actual energetic function of your mitochondria. So engaging in behaviors and in actions that actually stimulate that in you, whatever that is, and I think that's different for different people, is I think likely to have good health effects and good effects, on people's lives.
Yeah, beautiful. Well, Dr. Picard, this has been so much fun. This has been amazing. This is honestly one of my most favorite interviews I've ever done. I've really, really enjoyed talking to you. I thank you so much for the work that you've done. The research that you've done has had a profound influence on me and my thinking and the work that I do. And I would love to have you on again after you get the results back of the next study or two that you're doing. This has been just fascinating, and I hope to have you on again, maybe a couple more times over the next week. So,
that sounds great. Yes, and I'd be delighted. I had a lot of fun. Thank you for that.
Yeah, awesome. Well, have a wonderful night. I know you got to get home to dinner with your wife and your family. So thank you again for staying a little extra with me, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Also, one more thing before you go, I just want to mention for those of you who were fascinated with this topic and this podcast, if you want to follow Dr. Picard's work further, you can check out his website at picardlab.org, and you can follow him at Twitter at MitoSig Lab.